G'day, AJ Mahar here, keeping it real. In today's video, what is quiet borderline personality disorder? So today I'm answering the question, what is quiet borderline personality disorder? So many people want to know more about the quiet borderline. And so to the question, what is quiet borderline personality disorder? First of all, there's only one diagnosis, one borderline personality disorder, if you will. May have over 256 different symptoms, has different manifestations and presentations in people's lives, but two major ones. So the quiet borderline, person who is a quiet borderline has borderline personality disorder, okay? Often misdiagnosed, often missed in diagnoses, but when they get diagnosed, that's positive because if you know what you're dealing with, you can really work on it, and there is every hope for recovery. And recovery is real. Let me just say that. So the big difference to like what is quiet borderline personality disorder? Well, as I just said, it's borderline personality disorder, but it is a manifestation or presentation of it that is called quiet, referred to as quiet, not really in the DSM, but across the internet for sure. And there's a validity to this because there are people who have borderline personality disorder. They internalize everything. So when they feel shame, when they feel anger, when they get triggered, when they feel unworthy, when they're dealing with their core trauma, when they're dealing with the repetition compulsions, when they're doing all the same suffering, relatively same, every individual is different, right? But all the relatively same suffering as the classic acting out or the classic raging borderline, they're turning it all inside themselves. They internalize it all. The classic acting out, sometimes known as acting out raging borderline, externalizes everything. Every trigger is externalized. Every re-experiencing of abandonment fear, abandonment trauma, attachment trauma, what's really at the heart and core of BPD, and there's more moving pieces than that, but it's experienced very similarly across all people who are diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, unless and until they do seek a recovery process. People either make their lives way better to live. DBT skills can help people to create, like as Linehan said, or Linehan, sorry, a life worth living. But to get to full recovery from BPD, which I did in 1995, that can happen for those who seek it and those who stick with it. It's a difficult, often not short as we'd like it to be, process. I work with many people with BPD and have been doing for almost 25 years now. Many clients right now who I have, well, many who have BPD. I have probably 25 or so right now that I'm working actively with who fit the criteria. Well, it's not really criteria, but who are the quiet borderline, internalizing, acting in borderline. And as I do this sacred work with clients, all clients, it's sacred work, but this sacred work in particular with the quiet borderline, oh wow, I just can't even tell you how much that you can see and you can tell. And when we get through the process, I've had helped many people who are quiet, have quiet BPD to recover fully. And in that process, as opposed to working with the externalizing acting out borderline person, well, you see some differences for sure, not only in presentation and in what the process involves, but one of the biggest successes, and I know I've had this with clients recently, but I mean over the years, but even recently, one of the biggest successes when you're working with a person with quiet borderline, a person with borderline personality disorder manifesting the internal acting in quiet BPD type, I guess we could say. It's not really a type, but the excitement, and I don't mean that in the wrong way, but the sort of like relief that you sit there feeling, at least I do when I work with clients. I don't show anything, I don't, but internally I'm thinking, as I see them start to externalize anger, and deal with things and stop going in and hammering themselves. They invoke both those who okay, one thing at a time. So as I work with the quiet borderlines and I see them and I'm helping them to get to the process of connecting with what the anger and the rage is really about and what they've been turning in and why they've been handling things that way and what it really all means. It's almost a celebratory moment, not so much for me, but for me too, but for the client, because when they get to expressing and externalizing some anger and some rage, because they have just as much anger and rage, the core trauma, as the acting out borderline. And I think I've heard and seen some professionals say, that's not so. It is so. I've been working with clients who have quiet borderline, or they are quiet borderlines, for years and still am. And the core trauma is the same. It's what people do with it. And there's many myriad of reasons why. But basically, so the person with quiet BPD is internalizing everything. The acting out borderline externalizes it onto others. So it's the same general core trauma, the same, not exactly in each individual, but from the core trauma of abandonment and attachment trauma, etc., often sexual abuse, not for every person with BPD, and other forms of abuse, being infantilized or parentified. And in some cases, just being seen and unheard is pretty common, and that's really painful. But in many cases, you might have one parent that's infantilizing you with another one that's parentifying you. Either is so injurious to a young child. And many people go through that with narcissistic parents, right? Being infantilized or being parentified, but they maybe are just more resilient. But not everyone who goes through the same or similar core trauma will reach the level of being diagnosed with a personality disorder. It depends, right? So, and what it depends on is like a whole other video and everything. So the quiet borderline has the same core abandonment, attachment trauma, and or often meets with an emotionally invalidating environment. So emotionally unavailable parents, more often than not, 75% of cases, minimum. So internalizing quiet borderlines, we could look at the subtype, of Million, I think is his name, Theodore Million. It has a subtype. I'm not sure if it's directly a borderline personality disorder or not, but it's pretty, I think, unless you know more about a person who's got quiet BPD when you're working with them and helping them to get well and recover, the quiet borderline will probably look, or you might get a sense more that they're more discouraged than the externalizing acting out borderline. But that's a really hard thing to say in general, because you can't say that about everybody. And also, there are a lot of acting out borderlines that are extremely discouraged just because they're not internalizing. But the internalization of all of this, the invoked inner critic, internalizing all that and stuffing the anger and the rage inside, the quiet borderline, I can't say suffers more. These things are hard to quantify than the acting out externalizing borderline. But I think hurts people less, but still does hurt people, because when they withdraw, when they turn inward, when they can't relate anymore, and they're in this horrible place inside of doing to themselves, often in a way, if I could put it this way, what the acting out externalizing borderline will do to others. So the quiet borderline is suffering, triggers and abandonment fears and the approach avoidance conflict and the black and white all or nothing thinking, and has internalized the internal critic just the same as the acting out borderline. Everything goes in. And I've had clients who are quiet borderline individuals that will say, well, they'll explain things and they'll just say, well, this is the point right here when I get to, I just want to die, because what's the point? Because here's the thing, too many people, one person would be too many, but too many people with borderline personality disorder will commit suicide, will complete suicide. And I don't know if there are stats on this, but I don't think stats are really that accurate anyway, because not every suicide gets reported as one. Not every person who might have committed suicide because they had borderline personality disorder, they were quiet, acting and internalizing borderline. They don't all get diagnosed. That's another problem, misdiagnoses of these people. But they do commit suicide at a higher rate. And I can just say that I know that it has to be put within the framework of anecdotally, because from my own work over almost 25 years now with people with BPD among all the other clients and people I work with over various different challenges and healing journeys in their lives. People I've been working with the quiet internalizing borderline personality disorder will commit suicide than the acting out externalizing, but the numbers are still way too high, no matter if it's an acting out or an acting in, internalizing versus externalizing borderline. And of course, I help many people with BPD to recover too. Many people to just do much better. Some people don't stay in the process, but yeah, working with people with BPD, you, as a counselor or therapist, you will see, you will have many more experiences of clients committing suicide than working with other populations of mental health. It's a tragedy, and it's not anything that's getting better. Yeah, the quiet borderline has so much internalized self-hatred of a self not even known, and that doesn't mean that really they do something different with it, right? They internalize it, because the acting out externalizing borderline also has the same degree or measurable similarity of degree of self-hatred also. The acting in internalizing quiet borderline doesn't know how to express their needs. Like the acting out externalizing doesn't really know what those needs are or how to verbalize them. So they take it out on themselves, and that's the difference between the quiet borderline and the acting out classic, or sometimes called raging externalizing borderline. The quiet borderline also has a lack of trust for self, a self not known, lack of trust for others, always feels like they don't belong, feels like they don't fit in. And this is true of all people with BPD at certain points in their life, unless they get therapy. But many of these things I'm saying about quiet BPD, but the difference is that a person with quiet BPD, especially if they're really more high functioning, you may not even be able to tell if you're a coworker or even a friend. And in some cases, I work with partners of people with quiet BPD during, while working on relationships or after relationships have ended. But they don't generally end the way that the ones do with the externalizing, acting out borderline. And sometimes they don't end at all, and things can be managed, because the big difference with the quiet borderline, though they're suffering in a different way and really internalizing so much that is like very not only emotionally difficult, psychologically difficult, but it also really affects the mind-body connection, can really affect a quiet borderline perhaps even more in terms of physical health than an acting out externalizing one. It's hard to say. I don't know if anybody's measured these things. But with that, though, it's important to note that so many of the common core traits, the ones that delineate between BPD and those who don't have BPD, those human traits, with more intensity and more frequency, they are not so different in the quiet borderline as they are in the acting out or raging externalizing borderline. But the quiet internalizing, turning everything on self person with BPD, those are the people that partners and friends or loved ones will say, well, but I'm always getting a silent treatment, and they're just doing it to punish me. And there can be elements of that for some people who are quiet borderlines, but it's hard to say that it's conscious manipulation or conscious punishment. It can feel like punishment. But the bottom line is, I know the clients I work with and what I see with people with quiet BPD is they are being so hard on themselves. They are triggered back to emotional dysregulation, and they are then experiencing full-on invoked, internalized inner critic, but the negative parental voice, and they're like, I'm no good, and I'm bad, and I have no worth, and I shouldn't even be here, and I'm not worth it to live. These are the feelings times, 1,000 that they're ramming inside themselves over and over and over again. And so when they are silent, they often will withdraw. They need to take space. They're beating themselves up. It's internalized, putting everything back in internally. So they're still suffering, if not more, similarly measurably to the externalizing borderline, but you might not really know that. Some people sometimes with quiet BPD could show some anger, but not like the acting out borderline. And the other thing about this that's really important is that, so when the quiet, internalizing acting in borderline goes away, withdraws, or just, in the middle of conflict, maybe just, stops and goes in and goes away, they are triggered to emotional dysregulation. They are triggered to past trauma. They are triggered to what their whole narrative is from their invoked internal critic. And they dissociate from the here and now the same as the acting out borderline. And they also need to withdraw. Because you know how the acting out, externalizing borderline keeps coming at you, talks to you, rages, yells, screams, throws things, not every single person, but a lot. Then at various times. Well, the quiet borderline, not saying that could never happen once or something, or pound their fist on a desk or something, but they need to withdraw because they're, for lack of a better way to put it, it's horrible. They're busy beating themselves up. Difference is they're not doing to others what the acting out, externalizing borderline will be doing to others, as well as themselves at the same time. Not the same thing, but it has effects on them as well. And again, I'm not making any excuse for abuse. So when the quiet borderline needs to withdraw, then loved ones often feel that's a silent treatment, that they've been cut off. Sometimes they will end up cut off. But the point is that the quiet acting in, internalizing borderline, as with the other type of borderline, they don't have the words to express what they feel because they aren't so conscious of what the enormous pain of triggered emotional dysregulation is about. They don't, it's not like they can say, well, I'm feeling this, and this because of this, and this because of that, and I got triggered. Yes, after they have a lot of therapy, or after they go through DBT, they'll learn those things. But if they're untreated, it's what I call in the active throes of BPD. When the quiet borderline, they're not, usually, most, are not trying to punish you consciously in a manipulative way by not talking to you anymore, or by withdrawing, or by not picking up the phone, or by not texting you, or depending if you're in the same location or not, right? Or going in their room and not wanting to be, just like, leave me alone. Because they're in their own hell then internally. As I think people can have, if you realize that internal hell, that internalizing, putting everything inside and beating oneself to a pulp inside, psychologically speaking, but it's horrific for these people, is a little bit extra traumatizing each time they do it, then when the externalizing borderline classic acting out gets some of that out. Now, when they get it out, though, they're hurting people even more. And then everybody thinks, well, I'll do another video about that. Maybe I've done it here, but maybe I could do a more, accurate or in-depth comparison video about the quiet borderline and the acting out borderline. But the thing to really take note of is that, some males and females have borderline personality disorder. There might still be some diagnosis gender bias between, sometimes guys end up with NPD when they shouldn't. Sometimes, women might fit more NPD, but they end up with BPD. Sometimes there's that comorbidity. But the bottom line is, to this question, and I might have done another video on this, I'm not sure, but what is quiet borderline personality disorder? There's no such thing. There's borderline personality disorder as psychiatry defines it, which really isn't what it really is. If you want to be a humanist, if you want to really be a client-centered therapist, if you really understand borderline personality disorder, you're going to know that it's about the context, it's about the pain, it's about the experience, whether it was actually real or whether it is perceived is as real as actual, abandonment, attachment trauma, and then the things that go on to happen to them after they meet with the arrested emotional development at the age of about 2, and then they go on, and in these families with, that just a parent or parents having their own maybe cluster B personality disorder or some other issue, they diagnosed or undiagnosed, they are not emotionally available for children in the way that parents need to be. And then there's the 25%, I always want to make this clear in every video I do on this topic, of mothers or parents out there that their adult, or their children and then their adult children with BPD, whether they be acting in, internalizing quiet borderlines or acting out externalizing classic, raging borderlines, because they're both raging. They're just whether it's in at self or out at other, at times when triggered. Yeah, there's 25% of all those diagnosed with borderline personality disorder wherein there can still be some issues that might go back to mom, but not in the way of the 75%. Because these mothers are what psychology calls the, quote, good enough mothers. Mothers who were there, mothers who did the best they could, mothers who were nurturing, mothers who were, trying to meet their child's needs in infancy and toddlerhood and beyond. The difference there is, I think, that the sensitive temperament of those, which doesn't have to last a lifetime either. I mean, I recovered in 1995 fully, and I'm probably still a sensitive person. I'm a caring, empathic person, but I don't think I'm overly sensitive. Like, I'm certainly not. It changes when you recover. And I just want to say again, that recovery is possible, harder, more difficult with the quiet borderline in some ways, but can be maybe equally as long and because of the protective mechanisms, right? The defense mechanisms. And, I'm working with, well, more than a few, but I have a few clients right now with BPD, particularly quiet, but then I'm thinking also of clients who have the externalizing manifestation of the same borderline personality disorder diagnoses, that they're also equally as resistant to the next move they need to make, the next gaining more awareness and taking the next steps in their journey. They can be just equally as resistant at times, protective, as can the acting and internalizing quiet person with BPD. So it's a misnomer to think that there's something called quiet borderline personality disorder. There really isn't. And I just want to reiterate that sensitive temperament meets with an invalidating environment, which in the case of the 25% with what psychology calls the good enough mother, the good enough parents, that can be perceived abandonment versus actual, but it's just as real when they perceive it as if they actually are emotionally abandoned at times or don't get their needs met in a reasonably fast enough way. And I'm talking about infants and toddlers, right? When needs need to be met as they're mounted by the cry, or the time on the clock that the child needs a diaper change, needs to eat, and they need to be nurtured. And so in 75% of the cases, there's usually at least one parent, if not two, both, that can't nurture because many of them themselves have BPD, or they might be narcissists, or anywhere along cluster B or other personality disorders, other mental health challenges. So anyway, there is no such thing as quiet borderline personality disorder. There's borderline personality disorder. Quiet borderline internalizes, and the acting out borderline externalizes, and the quiet borderline acts in, and the other type, the acting out borderline is acting out. So it's acting in for the quiet borderline and internalizing everything. The invocation or the invoking of the inner critic is the same for both, but the quiet borderline keeps pushing it inside itself, believing the narrative that they really are everything they came to feel, believe, and or heard their parents say to them all the time. You're no good, you're this, you're that, you're a problem. Many have been parentified. Many people in general, but people with BPD, and maybe even more so when they manifest with the internalizing, acting in quiet presentation of borderline personality disorder. And make no mistake about it, they are both in like per individual, right? But they are in the same commiserate amount of pain from very similar, no two people are exactly alike, but very similarly caused, except for the 25%, types of trauma that they're dealing with. And the only other thing I want to say, it's true for the quiet acting and internalizing borderline as it is for the acting out externalizing borderline. These people, unless they are comorbid with NPD or something else, they are not the same as narcissists. They are not psychopaths. Women with quiet or acting out BPD are not the female variant of antisocial personality disorder. This is being forwarded by some professionals, and yet it's only a theory. And it's not even a theory that I think is going to be able to stand up over time. There is absolutely no proof of this. It's just been theorized. And really, I think it's a big mistake. But I think I've talked about that in another video. So I hope that was helpful, that there is no such thing as quiet borderline personality disorder.